In the last video, we installed Flutter for Mac. Now, if you're using Windows, let's now install it for Windows too. If you're using Mac only, you can therefore skip this video. So, to install Flutter on Windows, first of all, let's visit flutter.io, click on Get Started there, and then choose Install on Windows. There you will see all the installation steps in detail, and I strongly recommend also going through these step by step along with the video. Because for one, they can change in one or the other detail in the future. And then this is great to see or easy to see in that written form. And additionally, it's easy to miss a step. And therefore, this is a great companion for this video. So first of all, let's have a look at the system requirements. We install Flutter on our machine. We need Windows 7 or higher, the disk space, which is mentioned here, and important, one of these two tools, PowerShell or Git for Windows. Now, Git is a versioning system, and even if you don't use it actively, Flutter does use it. So here, I'll install Git for Windows by clicking on that link. Then we have the chance to download that Git tool from that Git page here. It should automatically give you the right download for your machine. Download it, and then walk through the installer. Now, in the installer, you can choose the place where you want to install Git. Then simply hit Next and, well, install that tool. Now, very important, you click Next a couple of times, and most of the default settings are fine. One important thing to note is that on this screen here, you should use Git from the Windows command prompt. Don't use one of the other two options, use the middle one here. This is also mentioned in the official docs. Now with that, hit Next a couple of times and leave all the other defaults. And with all that, simply hit Next one last time and it will install Git on your machine. And with that, you're fine. You can now close this and continue in the setup instructions. The next step is to actually install the Flutter SDK, which you can get from this download link here. Now important, the version of Flutter, of course, will change in the future. Right now it's 0.3.2.beta. It's production ready already, and the code you learn in this course will still be all correct in the future, even if you are downloading a different version, but make sure to download the version you're seeing here. So whatever version that is for you. So this will now also be downloaded. Will take a couple of seconds since it's quite a big file. And once it is downloaded, you can extract this folder into the place where you want to install that Flutter tool. Now important, the Flutter tool is not your project for your mobile app. It's a SDK, a software development kit, which you install globally on your machine and which you will use from different places on your machine to create new Flutter projects and to work with the ones you created. So to build them, to run them on an emulator, things like that. So unzip Flutter into that directory. Now, one important note about the directory you're storing your Flutter files in, make sure it's a directory where you don't need elevated permissions, so administration permissions, to run files in. Or you have an account where you always have admin permissions. That would be alternative. Then it doesn't matter where you install it, just as I'm doing it here. I do have admin rights, so no problem here. But if you have only rights for your user, make sure you store the Flutter installation somewhere in your user directory on Windows. So in a subfolder of your user directory or directly on the root level of your user directory. Don't store it in program files or any partition where you would need administrative rights to work with the files or to run the executable. So make sure to store it in your user folder instead if you're facing any issues or if you don't have administration rights by default. And once you unzipped it, you can go into that directory, and in my case here, I'll also move all the files up one folder so that they're all directly in the Flutter folder. And then you can execute that flutter console.bat file here. Now this will open up a command prompt which already uses Flutter. And you could stop here and continue with the Flutter commands and with bringing up your Android emulator and so on, and always open that tool here to run the Flutter commands which you need to run or build your app. However, I want to be able to use the normal command prompt. So let's close the Flutter console here. And let's move on and make sure that we can use the Flutter commands from the normal Windows command prompt. For that, we'll need to update our path. Now, the path, that simply is a global variable which Windows uses to find the tools we can use from the command line. And since we picked a custom folder where we installed Flutter, or where we unpacked it to, we need to make Windows aware of where that is. You do that by opening your control panel and then going to User Accounts, and there simply click on Change My Environment Variables. Now in the window which opens, you should find a path entry which you can select and where you then can click Edit. Now here you can add new locations of tools you want to be able to execute to that path by clicking on New here. And then here you need to enter the path to your Flutter folder, so the folder you unpacked. Simply go into your Windows Explorer and there navigate into the bin subfolder, to be precise, that is what you need. Copy the path to that bin subfolder and add it to your path variable by clicking New, adding it to that empty blank space which opens up, and thereafter hitting OK. Now you're prepared to run Flutter commands from the normal command prompt. Click OK and make sure to close any command prompts you might have opened already. Restart Windows if you're facing issues thereafter. And once you did all that, you can bring up the normal command prompt and simply enter Flutter there. Now, this might show you a warning regarding the installation being a bit older. You can ignore that because we actually did just install the latest version, so that will be all right. But the fact that you're seeing this and not something like Flutter not recognized means that we did successfully add it to our path and that we can use that Flutter command line tool from our command prompt. Now, Flutter is now available. The next step we have to do is we have to set up Android Studio. This is the official SDK provided by Google for building Android apps. And whilst we will not write native code with it, it includes all the SDKs and build tools Flutter will need too. So simply go to developer.android.com/studio or use the link you find in the Flutter installation documentation and download the Android Studio version there. It should automatically give you the right version for your operating system. You need to accept the agreement before you can continue. And with that, the download will start, and it will also take a while since it's also quite a big download. So let me fast forward to the point where this is done. Now, once the download did finish, simply execute the, executable you got, and the installer will start. Now, there you can continue. Make sure to choose Android Virtual Device as a component you want to install, though. That's important that you tick that. Thereafter, you can choose the location where you want to install Android Studio, and you can use the default here or pick your own location on your machine. And then you can simply hit Next. Now, this will again take a couple of seconds. And once it's done, you can start the Android Studio. And for the first time you start it, a wizard will come up, which allows you to configure it. Now, in that wizard, hit Next, and then choose Custom here. And the next step is that you can choose your UI theme. Now, that's mostly important if you want to use Android Studio to build your Flutter apps, which you can. However, I will use a different IDE in this course. And I will go with the dark theme here, but of course you can choose your favorite look. In the next step, it's important that you check Android Virtual Device, that this option is ticked, because we will need to be able to bring up such virtual devices. With that ticked, choose your Android SDK location, use the default or create your own path, and thereafter simply hit Next. Now, this will install a couple of things, and you can start the installation by hitting Finish here. This will actually take quite long because it downloads and installs a lot of packages, so don't worry if this takes a couple of minutes, maybe even 20 minutes or something like this, and I will be back once it's done for me. Once the installation did finish, you can, well, close the installer and then bring up Android Studio again. Now here, you can open an existing Android Studio project, which would be your Flutter app you're working on, but we don't have such an app yet. So our next step actually is to create such an app. However, we will need an emulator to view it. So let's make sure we fulfill all requirements for that. You can see them here in the official docs. And by the way, if you want to install your app on a real device, that is something we'll also do later in the course. And you can, of course, already go through the steps you see here if that's important to you right now already. But again, we'll do this together later in the course. For the majority of the course, we will work on the emulator though. So there on the emulator, you see that it's important that we have hardware acceleration enabled on our machine. Click that link to learn more about it and see how to turn it on. And thereafter, we can go back to Android Studio, and now we need that Flutter project to continue. So back to the command prompt. There, you should now navigate into the folder where you want to create your new Flutter project. You can navigate around in Windows with the cd command to change the directory you're in the command prompt. Now make sure to create a folder and navigate into that folder where you want to store your Flutter app. And once you're in that folder, you can create a new Flutter application and project by running flutter create and then the name of your project. Now important, that name must not contain a dash or something like that, also not a white space. Words should be separated with underscores, or you simply use one word only. So flutter create first underscore app is my command here to create this project. And now this will add a new folder in the location you're in the command prompt and configure your first Flutter project in there. As you can see, it creates a couple of files. And once it's done with all that, you can open the project in Android Studio by clicking on Open an existing Android Studio project. And there you should navigate to that folder you just created and open it there in the Flutter folder in my case. So basically open that project you just created, first underscore app in my case. This will open it in Android Studio. And before we do anything there, let's bring up that virtual device. You can do that by, in Android Studio, going to Tools and then AVD Manager, which stands for Android Virtual Device Manager. And in the window, which then opens up, you can start a new virtual device by clicking on to Create Virtual Device. You should also have one by default, which you can use, but let me show you how to create a new one. There you choose your blueprint, basically regarding the general hardware and layout profile. I'll go with the Pixel 2 here. On the next screen, you choose the image, the Android version you want to use. And I recommend not going with the cutting edge version, but using the latest stable version. In my case, Oreo API level 27. Typically, that's the one which is selected by default. Hit next again. Now on the next screen, make sure to choose hardware acceleration from the graphics drop down there. And you can have a look at the advanced settings, but you typically don't need to change these. And with that all done, you can finish that and create that new virtual device. Now with it created, you can start it by clicking on that play button on the right. And this will open the virtual device on your screen. It will bring up an Android phone on your machine, so to say. Now, with that running, we can't run our Flutter app yet because we still need to do some things. For one, we need to install the missing dependencies, the missing plugins. For that, click on Install Plugins here at the top where it tells you about the missing Dart plugin. You could, by the way, also skip this if you already installed the Flutter plugin, but here I do it in two separate steps. So install that Dart plugin. Once the installer is done, you need to restart Android Studio. And once you restart it, you should actually get a message here at the bottom where it suggests you a new plugin. Expand that message and click on Configure Plugins, and there it will suggest the Flutter plugin. Simply accept this by clicking OK, and now it will install the Flutter plugin too, and that would have installed the Dart plugin with it, so you can actually do that in one step only. And once this is done, you need to restart the IDE one more time. So let's do that. Let's restart the IDE again. And now we have Android Studio configured to support Flutter. Now, we still don't see our emulator here at the top, and therefore we still can't start our application. Let's quit the emulator for now. And to make it work, first of all, go back to the setup instructions and make sure to install that Google USB driver. Now, that should only be important for running it on a real device, but it still doesn't hurt to set it up already so that it will work later. So click on that link you see there and install the USB driver. You can do that from within Android Studio by going back into it, and there going to Tools, SDK Manager, and in the SDK Manager, go to SDK Tools and choose Google USB Driver there. Hit OK thereafter or apply and install it. You also need to accept the license agreements there. Now, with it installed, you will need to also do one more thing if you installed your Android SDK in a different place on your operating system than the one suggested during the wizard, which I did. You need to add one other environment variable. You can also see that if you go back to the command prompt and run Flutter Doctor, a tool which tells you what's missing. Here it tells me that it's unable to locate the Android SDK. And therefore, I will go back to my control panel and there to user accounts, and then change my environment variables. And first of all, we need to add a brand new variable. So click New here. And then name that variable, and the name is important, Android_home, all uppercase. Make sure to not add a typo here. Now, with that name defined, you need to define a value, and that simply is a path pointing to the Android SDK. You can click Browse Directory here to choose the Android SDK location, and there simply choose the location you selected during the wizard or in the wizard which opened or which ran when you opened Android Studio. In my case, it's the Android folder. It should be this folder which has a platforms, emulator, and so on subfolder. Simply hit OK with the root folder selected, and now you also need to add something to your path variable. So select that again and click on Edit, and there you need to add two new entries. The first one should be %, and then Android home, so that variable name you just created, written exactly in the same way, and then another %, \tools, and then you need to add one other entry, which is also %, Android home, \platform tools. Make sure it's written exactly as you see it here in the video. Now, with that added, hit OK and restart the command prompt. And now also restart your virtual device by quitting it, potentially wiping the user data if you're facing issues restarting it, and then hitting the green play button again. This will bring up the emulator again. And now you should see it here in the drop-down selected. And now you can press that Run button to run your Flutter app on that virtual device. Now, this build process, which will start it on the device, can take a couple of minutes when you run it the first time. Don't worry about that. And once it's done, you should see your Flutter app running on that emulator. And you can hit the plus button here to increment the counter. Pretty awesome. Our Flutter app finally running on an emulator. And of course, we'll change this app soon. Now, as I mentioned, I won't use Android Studio as an editor here. And therefore, I also want to show you a way of running this without Android Studio. You can do that by going to the command prompt, navigating into the folder where you have your first app or into this project folder you created. And in there, you can run Flutter run. And this will now do the exact same as you did with the command inside, or with the click of the button inside Android Studio, but without you doing it through Android Studio. It will build the app and ship it to your emulator and run it there. And this is actually how I will run my apps for the rest of this course, since I won't use Android Studio. You can use either approach, however, using Flutter Run will have advantages like the hot reloading I'll introduce in a second.